What is going on, everybody? Welcome to JetCast. As always, I am your host, Pat, and today we got Nick Faria with us. Nick, how you doing?
How's everything going, Pat? Great to be on.
Awesome. So we got a lot to talk about, and the first thing that I want to discuss with you is something that you would know a lot about, and that's Hassan Reddick. So, from my perspective, okay, they just basically traded away Huff and a third-round pick and got back Hassan Reddick, and I don't know if I think that was a good deal. Okay. Huff, from my point of view, is very much a situational pass rusher. I think it was something like 40% of the snaps. And I wonder what type of effect he's going to have if he is playing all the downs. So, from my point of view, getting rid of Huff and bringing in Hassan Reddick, who I think is going to be an automatic 10 sack guy, is a no brainer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's kind of multi-layered because this situation is pretty complex. First off, Hassan Reddick wants to be paid among the top pass rushers in football, meaning he wants well over $20-25 million a year. And the Eagles were never going to pay him that money. They didn't want to pay Bryce Huff that money. Annually, he's making $17 million in Philadelphia. So ultimately, if you look at it from the Eagles' perspective, they got a third-round pick that could become a second-round pick in a couple of years, but it's still quality draft capital for Howie Roseman to play with. In that retrospect, it absolutely works for them. They get younger at a key position. They get a high-energy guy, a good locker room guy. All of that makes sense. But then you have it on the Jets side. Part of the trade is that Philadelphia only gets a second-round pick if Hassan Reddick plays a certain percentage of snaps. And the Jets have historically never played their defensive linemen well over 70% of the snaps where Reddick was in Philadelphia. So I think it's a safe bet to assume that the Eagles are only getting a third-round pick for Hassan Reddick. It's very difficult for me to see Reddick play 75% of the downs like he did in Philadelphia. But with the Jets, it's really quite simple. When you are talking about a championship caliber team and a championship caliber defense, you need 5 positions of true value: a quarterback, a receiver, an offensive lineman / left tackle, depending on who the best player is, a top corner, and a top pass rusher. They didn't really have that to this point. I think Quinnen Williams is an all-around great defensive player, but I'm talking a guy that consistently gets 10 sacks every single year. Hassan Reddick fits that bill to a T. He's a perfect fit for this defensive system. Overall, this was a fantastic move for the Jets. Originally, I thought it was an absolute fleece. After the Stephon Diggs trade, when Buffalo only got essentially a third-round pick for him, or a day 2 pick, that made me kind of realize, okay, Philadelphia was never going to get what they wanted for Reddick. They got the best offer. It makes sense. We move, essentially.
I think it's a win-win on both sides, especially from the Jets' perspective. We're a win-now team, and losing a guy of Huff's caliber, you had to replace him with somebody. But I agree with you. I don't think he's going to hit that 75% mark, especially with the rotation that they have. Now, obviously, we need McDonald to step up. We really don't know what he's going to be. Right, he's played the least amount of any of the first round picks, and that's really concerning to me. But I really think that JJ could have a double-digit sack season along with Reddick, considering the interior of that line is going to garner a lot of respect between Quinnen, JFM still there, and Kinlaw. Now, Kinlaw may be an overpay. I'll concede that, but obviously he's played for Robert Saleh already, and Robert, the coach knows. He must know something about him or think that he's not being utilized properly, especially to garner that sort of contract. So, again, I think it's win-win on both sides. So, moving on a little bit here to wide receiver. So, what sort of effect do you think Williams is going to have on this offense? I think it's going to really loosen up a lot of things for Garrett and Brees, especially Brees coming out of the backfield. I know it was shocking that the offensive coordinator was like, "Oh, I didn't know Brees could play so well out of the backfield." It was mind-blowing to me, but I could see a lot of things opening up for them, especially if they are able to get. I did a video on this, I think last week, where if they can get another wide receiver, possibly in the 3rd round or 4th round, depending on what they do, with the 10th pick, you could have a situation where Williams and another big body receiver on the outside, and you put Garrett Wilson like in the slot he's being covered by a nickel, and that's just going to cause a ton of problems. So what sort of effect is Williams going to have on this offense, and what do you see going forward with the draft as far as wide receiver?
Yeah, it's kind of two-pronged when we talk about Williams' impact. First off, he is the perfect, and I stress perfect receiver with Aaron Rodgers, a big body guy with speed. That is someone that Rodgers has thrived with throughout his career. Even
that's
when
what they
in his
hoped
early days
Lazard
in
was
Green
going to
Bay.
be. That's what
Exactly.
they hoped Lazard was going to be, and he never panned out.
But he didn't have the speed that Williams had, or some of these older,
Right.
or the older guard of the Green Bay Packers had. Williams is a surefire pick. We got to remember that Lazard did not come from this ultimate, receiver class, this ultimate college of great receivers. He came from essentially a solid overall program that developed into a pretty solid receiver out in Green Bay. He had a terrible first year. I think he will even acknowledge that. But when you bring in Williams, this takes the pressure off of him. Now he's a third and fourth option, which I think he could really thrive in that particular role. But this is all about Aaron Rodgers. This is all about making sure this offense has enough weapons for your franchise quarterback to be able to succeed at every single level. And when you talk about Garrett Wilson, he can win pretty much everywhere on the field, outside, inside. It doesn't really matter. He's going to succeed. Same thing with Breece Hall. The big question is going to be, is Williams going to be healthy enough to make an impact right away? I think the clear answer to that, at least right now, is no, because he mentioned in his introductory press conference that week one is a possibility. It's hopeful, but we still don't know exactly what's going to happen there. So I think it would make sense for the Jets to draft a receiver. I just don't know if it makes sense for them to use the 10th pick on one. And I look at the top three receivers, Romeo Dunze, Malik Neighbors, and Marvin Harrison. I think it's a good chance that two or all three are gone by the time the Jets pick at 10. And if that's going to be the case, they're going to have to make a decision. Do they stay at 10 and take an offensive lineman, or do they trade back and try to get multiple bites of the apple, try to accumulate a second-round pick? I actually put out an article this afternoon on Sports Illustrated and Fan Nation with Jets Country, essentially detailing sort of the moves that they could make where they could acquire a second-round pick. But ultimately, if it's between Romeo Dunze and someone like Olu Fashanu, it's going to be a very difficult decision to make for the Jets, because you can obviously entice the offense with another receiver to protect Williams and not force him on the field too early off his ACL surgery. But at the same end, if you draft Olu Fashanu, you have protection now that you can trust should Tyron Smith or Morgan Moses, who are 33 years old, if either one of them go down, you have that protection for Aaron Rodgers.
I am concerned about the depth behind Garrett Wilson and Williams. I think if they do end up getting a wide receiver, either in the beginning of the draft or later on in the draft, you could easily see Lazard end up being wide receiver 4.
Yeah,
especially if even if they don't take somebody and Xavier Gibson starts stepping up, I could totally see Lazard being a wide receiver 4. It just seemed like he was out of it by the end of the season. I mean, they have videos of him playing with a soccer ball, not only at practice, but, before games. So it's going to be really interesting what they do at wide receiver. And the more I think about the draft, the more I am talking myself into that they're going to trade back. Just because, especially if there's a big time player at their spot, especially at quarterback, Joe Douglas is going to be open for business, because they'll be able to recoup a second round pick, drop back only a few spots. I think the Raiders are a big possibility to move up, especially if there's a quarterback there. They're going to want to jump the Vikings, and I forget who else. Oh, Denver, right? They're going to want to jump up and take somebody. So I think the more I think about it, the more I'm talking myself into that they're going to trade back. Because if there really is a run on quarterbacks, there's going to be a plethora of guys to pick from. Maybe Brock Bowers. I know there's a lot of talk on Twitter about Brock Bowers. I'm not that high on Brock Bowers, just because the history of tight ends going in the beginning rounds is in the first rounds is not that great. But running back. Moving on to running back, is he really a viable running back to behind Brees Hall? Who are they going to get? I mean, I don't know. We can't put it all on Brees.
No,
You
and
know,
I
yes,
I
he
think it'd
can be
be
an every
foolish.
down back. Yeah,
Yeah.
he can be an every down back, but he can't be an all game back. You know,
No, and
there has to be somebody.
I think it would be foolish. And I know the Jets would feel that way as well, but it would be foolish to trust Brees Hall to get 25, 30 touches. Because if you're trying to maximize a player, you don't want him burning out before he turns 26 years old. That's just
Right.
foolish,
Absolutely.
foolish.
Especially a player that has a surgically repaired knee, even as good as he played.
Exactly.
You know?
And ultimately, they are high on Izzy. They are high on Abanaconda for a number of different reasons. First off, he's a good returner. He's a good back out of the backfield. He's shifty. I really liked what I saw out of him both in the preseason and later on in the year. But ultimately, I don't know if it's going to be in the draft that they find a running back in free agency. I think it's going to be a situation where the draft comes and goes. They don't select one at all with their draft selections, and then they pick one up in free agency. Remember, I think people kind of forget this, where free agency doesn't just end right before the NFL draft. What happens is a lot of these guys that are available, they look and say, okay, my market isn't there right now. Let's wait till after the draft to find a deal and get a team that would fit my skill set to have some interest in me. And there's still a couple of players in free agency that would make a lot of sense. I think Dobbins specifically is certainly the top choice overall. But there are plenty of veteran running backs out there that can spell Hall for 2, 3, 4 touches a drive where you don't have to put all the pressure on him, because I think the Jets would agree with it. I think Aaron Rodgers would agree with it. Most NFL executives would agree. It's foolish to waste a top talented running back so early in his career just because you don't have a backup ready to go when you have plenty of veterans that can do the job.
Look what happened to Saquon Barkley.
Yeah.
You know, I think he's obviously was overused by the Giants, and hindsight for them, they should have paid him instead of Daniel Jones. I think he's I think he's a little. I think it would have worked out better for them if they paid him instead of Daniel Jones.
I don't know,
but for you, you're an Eagles fan. I mean, the combination between Hurts and Barkley is going to be, I think,
it's going to be fun.
It's going to be fun to watch.
But the other piece that I think people forget, the Giants' mistake wasn't that they paid Jones over Barkley. The mistake they made was drafting Barkley in the first place. Because I can argue about paying running backs, and more than an amount of money, but you're not taking one with the second overall pick. In reality, Quentin Nelson, who I thought was one of the best offensive linemen of his entire class of the generation, he was going to be available. And I thought the Giants, if they were truly dead set on just keeping the Eli Manning years going, then prolonging his career with a quality offensive line was going to be the selection, and they passed on him for Barkley. The mistake, to me, we can say, oh, well, Barkley they should have paid him over Jones, but the offensive line for the Giants has been terrible for a very, very, very long time. They've been as inconsistent as the New York Jets. They maybe not have dealt with as many injuries, but they have just been atrocious for well over a decade. And ultimately, you put any running back behind a bad offensive line, and you're going to see some struggles. I'm very interested to see it because with Philadelphia, they have one of the best offensive lines in football. They're probably going offensive line in the first round of this draft anyway. What's that going to look like when you've got 4 all-pro players and Saquon running behind you? I think that's the enticing thing to me overall.
Talking about offensive line, it's a temporary Band-Aid, I think, with having Morgan Moses and Tyron Smith. But I think for the next 2 years, the offensive line is fixed, I think, as long as Smith stays healthy. I think we finally have the offensive line that Joe Douglas has been talking about and promising all this time. The two biggest things, and we'll get to quarterback, but the two biggest things I think Joe Douglas whiffed on was obviously Zach Wilson, which we'll get into, but Mekhi Becton. Mekhi Becton is not the player that he thought he was going to be. He may have been if Van Roten didn't roll over his knee in his first game of his second year. But that the miss on Becton, I think, set this line back at least 2 to 3 years, hoping that he could come back, hoping that he could play the way we all thought he was going to play. But the offensive line now, Tyron Smith, that contract is very incentive laden for him. So I think he's going to be really motivated to want to play. But not only motivated for money, but he said he came here because he wants to win. He sees the Jets as a winning organization, which is shocking for a lot of us to hear. What sort of projections do you see for this offensive line? Do you think do you think Smith is going to be able to play the full year? AVT, do you think he stays healthy all year? Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'll start with Tyron Smith in that first question. No, I think it's a safe bet that he's not playing a full 17 games. This is nothing against him. When he's healthy, he's an all-pro player. He's played like an all-pro player. He did even last year when he was at full strength. So he's still a quality player. But being with all the injuries that he's had to his back, to his knee, to his ankle, it's foolish to think he'll play a full 17 games. Now, with Elijah Vera Tucker, it's a little bit different because both of these injuries came after multiple weeks where he was playing different positions and practicing in different spots. You're not going to have to worry about that next year. I mean, you have Morgan Moses at right tackle. You can trust him to solidify the right tackle position. You have Tyron Smith at left tackle. You can trust him at left tackle. The question, of course, do you keep John Simpson at left guard? Do you keep AVT at right guard? All of that is semantics, but I think ultimately right now, Elijah Vera Tucker is going to stay at right guard. And I think ultimately that's only going to prolong his health. He's going to have a good season because he doesn't have to worry about different techniques for different positions and different techniques for different pass rushers. So ultimately, I think the projection of this offensive line, there was a report out there that said this was a top 10 offensive line going into the season. I think it's a very fair projection. I mean, you look at AVT, at full strength, he's a top guard in the game. Tyron Smith, one of the top 5 left tackles in football. I'm really high on Joe Tippmann, particularly after the rookie season he had. Morgan Moses is a plus right tackle. I would put him in the top 10 conversation of right tackles in the game. When you have all of that together, there's clearly a path for this offensive line to be one of the best in football. The only question, of course, is what the depth is going to look like. I like Wes Schweitzer as sort of this interior sixth man up kind of role where he's going to be the immediate backup if AVT or Simpson or Tippmann go down for a couple of plays. I think that's a safe bet overall. But the question comes into, okay, do you trust Carter Warren or Max Mitchell to be the immediate backup to Smith and Moses? And I think most Jet fans will say no. I know the Jets coaching staff is very high on Carter Warren. I'm high on Carter Warren. But I don't know if I'm high on him enough to say they shouldn't take a tackle at 10 or they should trade back to take Troy Fautanu out of Washington. It's really going to come down to the overall depth and see where the Jets feel comfortability-wise with this entire group. But it would be foolish to me if this team just ignores the offensive line in the draft, particularly with how deep this tackle class really is.
Right. And that was always my argument with AVT is that he got hurt playing tackle. And yes, he played some tackle in college, but he is a guard. He's actually a very good guard. And yes, him staying there and not having to worry about all, having to do all the work basically, I think is going to do him, is going to be great for him. And I said I'd bring it up. Nobody wants Zach, and I'm not surprised.
No one wants Zach yet. No one wants Zach yet. I think
no one wants Zach yet. And yes, we're going to go into training camp with Zach as our QB3. I'm calling it now.
Well, I think that's yeah.
And they'll move on from him, or they'll find someone for him when another QB goes down somewhere else. That's where I think it's going to happen.
Happens all the time. It happens all the time. Listen, I walked in, and let me give you all a history lesson that isn't really a history lesson because it happened just 8 years ago. But in 2016, Philadelphia had Sam Bradford under contract. They signed Chase Daniels to a long-term backup extension, and then they traded up for Carson Wentz with the second overall pick. By the start of training camp, Wentz was QB3, and Sam Bradford was going to be the starting quarterback for Philadelphia in Doug Peterson's first year. What happens? Teddy Bridgewater has a gruesome knee injury that altered his entire career and altered the career of the entire Minnesota Vikings franchise, if you will. Then, because the Vikings were so desperate, they gave up a first-round pick for Sam Bradford. And they got him in here. Philadelphia gave him up, and they started Wentz week 1 right away. This isn't to say that I'm hoping, and no one should be hoping for any player getting hurt in training camp, but injuries happen. God forbid Trey Lance were to go down in Dallas, or Carson Wentz were to go down in Kansas City in training camp in a non-contact drill. These things happen all the time. And if that were to happen, the number one trade target for a lot of these teams is probably going to be Zach Wilson, because you look at the Cowboys, you look at the Chiefs, they know that they can develop quarterbacks, and they know that their quarterback has been consistently healthy for the majority of their career, so they wouldn't put a lot of pressure on Wilson to play this season, a la the Jets with Aaron Rodgers. So I think it's a safe bet overall. Yes, I do agree. Zach Wilson's probably going to be on the team during training camp, but anything can happen. And I certainly think he will be moved at some point during camp, solely because the Jets don't want him and he doesn't want to be there.
Right. What are the chances that the Jets take a quarterback late? I think it's actually high. Pretty high. Very high. I did a video recently. The guys that were on my target were, just looking at my list here, Rattler, Jordan Travis. I had Pratt, and then I had maybe Sam Hartman. But the thing with Sam Hartman is he is older, and if Aaron Rodgers plays the 4 years, like everybody, like he says he's going, Hartman's going to be 30 years old by the time he sees the field. I like the idea of Rattler if he's there in the third round. Who do you think is kind of the best fit? Because the idea of putting a quarterback and letting him sit there for 3 years, Green Bay's done it twice in a row. Look how well it's turned out for them.
Well, I think it's the only way to develop quarterbacks. And I think most teams now, they fall into the trap of, we need to play this guy right away. We need to play this guy right away.
Well, they have to. They have to because of the way the CBA is in the contracts.
They don't, though. That's the thing. At least not the first year. And I think the Packers, what they do is they stay patient overall. And it's worked out for them in droves. But teams don't have to play the rookie right away. And I think the big mistake people make is they force these guys in game 1, week 1, or game 3, week 1. They need time to develop, to learn the speed of the game, to learn the offense and become masters of it before they step on a football field. I think Robert Saleh kind of pointed this out as well later in the year about the Jets sort of failing Zach Wilson at times, where the best thing for Zach when he was drafted was to sit behind a veteran, because he was very talented, but very raw as a passer. But the Jets still threw him out there week 1 anyway. I thought that was a gruesome mistake. You kind of saw it. The confidence that he had just wasn't there in the National Football League from where he was in college. He just wasn't the same player. He wasn't the same confident guy who could step into a throw and deliver a great pass. Granted, is he a good quarterback? Probably not. Is Justin Fields a good quarterback? Probably not. Is Trey Lance a good quarterback? Probably not. His draft class is mired by disappointment overall.
People are questioning Trevor Lawrence now.
And let's be fair. They have a right to. They have a right to. As the number 1 overall pick, I had Lawrence as a better quarterback prospect than Andrew Luck. I was so high on this guy coming out of college.
Yeah.
I thought Jacksonville was a far worse situation than the Colts were when they drafted Andrew Luck, because they still had Reggie Wayne. They still had a plethora of older talent that Luck could win with. They didn't have a quarterback. Lawrence came into a terrible situation. I thought the first year you give him a pass. The second year with Doug Peterson, clearly he showed that he could be a franchise quarterback. I thought they were ascending upward, but this third year was a disaster. They didn't make the playoffs. And when you have Doug Peterson, you have Trevor Lawrence, that is inexcusable. A lot of people jumped on Nick Sirianni not being as good as Doug Peterson, but Nick Sirianni's been to the playoffs for his first 3 years, and Doug Peterson has missed the playoffs in 2 of his last 3. So let's be fair about that overall argument. But again, going back to the quarterback situation in the draft, I think the number 1 guy, if I were the Jets, it's Jordan Travis. Travis is an all-around great passer. He's athletic, a lot of concern for his leg, but this is why you would take him in the later rounds. You wouldn't have to put much pressure on him to play right away. Let him develop into this offense. Let him grow. And then in a couple of years when Rodgers retires, you give him a chance to see what he can do. And if he can't, well, then you take a quarterback high anyway. It doesn't really matter. Travis is the kind of project you look at and say he can win a lot of different ways. I know you mentioned Rattler, Pat, but ultimately with Rattler, I think he's going third or fourth round to a team that wants that sort of project that isn't really a project that could maybe start a couple times a year. And I just don't think the Jets are going to waste a third or a fourth round pick on a quarterback when you still have needs at receiver, you still have needs at offensive line, and you could also draft a safety. There's questions at that position as well.
Speaking of safety, I hope they end up. They have to be talking to Justin Simmons. I don't
know if they have the cap for him.
Yeah. The draft is such a crapshoot. I mean, going back to 2018 and talking about Saquon Barkley, I mean, everybody thought Saquon and Sam Darnold were going to be the two pillars of New York football, and we both passed on Josh Allen. So, but it's such a crapshoot. It really is.
This is kind of the point that I'm making, though, because I'm sorry, I had him on my mind. Sam Darnold.
Yeah.
If Darnold was in a better situation, does he develop into a good starting quarterback? If Saquon Barkley runs behind a great offensive line, is he considered a generational running back? We got to remember when Ezekiel Elliott was drafted by the Cowboys, 4th or 6th overall back in 2016, he was running behind an offensive line with all pros and Tyron Smith, Zach Martin, Travis Frederick. That line was stacked, and he ran and had an unbelievable 2 years. Where you get drafted is so important. And the Giants didn't have the offensive line for Barkley, and the Jets didn't have the offensive capabilities for Darnold. It really just comes to that. Would Josh Allen, if he was drafted by the Jets with that third pick, is he as successful as he is today? Probably not.
But I think at least we're in a little bit of a better situation. We would even be in a better situation today if we did not get rid of Sam Darnold. I was very adamant that we should not have picked Zach Wilson. I wanted to keep. I know you had to pay Sam probably, but I thought he was a much better quarterback than a kid coming out of BYU that didn't play anybody. And you could take the argument, oh, we don't get the picks that we get for Sam. I'm like, the Niners gave up 3 first-round picks to take the third spot, right, and take Lance. You could have gotten a king's ransom for that second-round pick. You could have had the picks to still get Breece Hall later down the line if we're going, hindsight is 2020. But I was always of the opinion, and I still am, that we will be in a better situation today. Maybe not have Aaron Rodgers, but we would be in a better.
But that's an important
long-term situation. I know. The only reason why we have Aaron Rodgers is because Zach Wilson was so horrid.
Well, it's
a catch-22.
It's not just that, though. It's not just that Zach Wilson was bad, and I think people kind of forget this. Yes, Zach Wilson being bad directly impacted what the Jets were going to do last year in free agency. Trading for Aaron Rodgers was the best-case scenario, and they got him in here. But Rodgers could have retired. He could have just said, I'm done. I'm good. He was already contemplating it. Why did he want to join the Jets? Well, because they drafted Breece Hall, who was going to be the offensive rookie of the year had he not gotten hurt in Denver. You had Garrett Wilson, who ended up winning offensive rookie of the year. You had an elite defense that had Sauce Gardner and C.J. Mosley and Quinn Williams. And you had offensive pieces like Elijah Vera Tucker to entice Rodgers enough to say, there are pieces here. They're okay. This is not a bad football team. I want to play here because I think I can get a championship out of them. If Rodgers is healthy last year with all the problems the Jets had, with all the issues, offensive line, coaching, receiver play, if Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback, do the Jets go 10-7? Do they beat the Patriots? Do they beat the Falcons, the Raiders, when all they needed was 20 points? I think it's a safe bet. And if you're at 10-7, you're fighting for a playoff spot. Now we're in a completely different conversation going into 2024. His injury completely tore everything apart, but he's still back for 2024. He's still back. He's still healthy. Hindsight's always going to be 2020. What if they did this? What if they did that? All that in between. There's very few times where a 4-time NFL MVP, a future Hall of Fame quarterback wants to join your team. The Jets being able to build a team good enough to entice him was absolutely the best case scenario for them, not just for now, but for the long term, because it shows, listen, we can argue about Joe Douglas all we want. He can find talent. They can develop defensive talent if they can just put a good season together, build some continuity, build some confidence, build some cash so the head coach is not on the hot seat every year. We're looking at a quantifiable leap for this franchise, not just in 2024 or 2025, but in the future years as well.
You know, everything last year really just comes back to Aaron Rodgers. You know, the fact that when he goes down, you know, you are now having to dumb down the playbook significantly for Zach Wilson. And that messes up the timing on the routes. That messes up the blocking schemes. That messes up so many other things that us fans don't really see that happen behind the scenes, that happen in the huddle. And the idea that Aaron Rodgers can't fix a lot of issues with that offense that you know, I think is a bad take. You know, him being there fixes a lot of things.
Changes everything.
Everybody being, I mean, you're talking about an offensive line that's going from having to block 4.5 plus seconds to maybe only having to block 2.5 or less. And that's where the injuries start piling up, because you're asking guys to now block further into these defensive stunts. And that's where people get rolled up on. And that's where injuries happen. It's a snowballing effect. Last thing, what is your gut? I told you what my gut with the draft is. I think they're going to end up trading back. What is your gut? If you had, $100 to your name, what are the Jets going to do in the draft?
They're taking Olu Fashanu. And I'm going to say this. The math, and I've broken this down on JetCast on these streams on Wednesday so many times. The math, the projection of how this draft is going to fall. It seems like New York is going to have an opportunity and a choice between Brock Bowers and Olu Fashanu. Mm-hmm. If they want extra bites of the apple, you trade back with Cincinnati. You give up the rights to Fashanu. You trade back with Cincinnati, pick up a second-round pick. You take Troy Fautanu out of Washington. Then you take a receiver in the second round with the 49th overall pick, whether that's Ladd McConkey, whoever it is. 49th pick, you take a receiver. Third round, Christian Haynes. If they go Fautanu, Haynes, and a second-round receiver, I think that's an A++ draft by Joe Douglas. But ultimately, push comes to shove. Douglas looks at this roster and says, we are one offensive line injury away from going back to the Stone Age with this group. I can find a receiver in free agency. Aaron Rodgers can win with anyone outside a receiver. He has shown the ability to do that. He has shown without an offensive line, this ain't going anywhere. We need depth. We need skill. And if I am looking at a 2-week window without Tyron Smith, who do I trust more? A Mike Williams-less receiving core or a Tyron Smith or a Carter Warren offensive line? Ultimately, I am looking at the smartest thing for the Jets to do outside of trading back, which is I think the number one thing Douglas should do. Cards on the table, what they're going to do at 10, they're going to take Olu Fashanu.
All right. Awesome. So I want to thank you for hanging out with me. I'm going to try and do more for everybody watching. I'm going to try and do more live streams on Wednesday afternoon around this time. Nick, I'd love to have you back on, but we're going to have a lot of cool guests on. For those of you on Twitter, please give us a follow on other platforms. Give us a follow on Twitter. We have our Twitter space tonight from 7 to 9. We got Cody Goodwin of CBS Sports, and we got Mark Malusis tonight. Going to talk some football. Going to talk some draft. Again, Nick, thank you. And for everybody watching, please give us a like and a subscribe. It's the best way you can help the channel. Any last words, Nick? Last words. Any parting words? Last words.
It's gonna be a lot of fun. This is 2 weeks away. This is the time to get really excited. This is also the time where trades begin to be discussed. And if the Jets are looking to trade back for a player, for extra picks, this is the time to start getting those conversations in there.
And everybody, give Nick a follow on YouTube. He's got his own channel called Football Faria. Nick, how often do you How
So
often do you try and live stream?
normally it's a Monday, Wednesday, Friday piece.
Okay.
Today obviously changed. Today was
Ah.
going to be streaming day, but I have no problem jumping on here.
Oh, well,
But I'll
thank
be
you.
back on Friday with a show. Maybe even doing stuff over the weekends. It's still kind of fluctuating the schedule a little bit.
Yeah.
Still getting
Yeah.
started.
All right, awesome. Well, again, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for everybody who's watching. And like I said on Twitter, we'll see you guys tonight at 7. Give the channel a subscribe. Thanks again, guys.
Appreciate it.